The distinguishing characteristic of poetry for me has always been the musical element, what the poets themselves have called song. And in the poems which I'm about to read, I've endeavored really to follow that tradition which has been in existence for 2,000 years. The song quality, or what Swinburne called the pulse of music. One of the poems, The Highwayman, was a very juvenile poem, while the others are comparatively late. But I hope that the pulse of song may be evident in all of them. The wizardry of which this poem is an expression is, of course, the way in which all nature may be regarded as a magical process, acorns developing into oak trees, and oak trees perhaps into great fleets of ships. There's many a proud wizard from Araby to Egypt, can read the silver writing of the stars as they run, and many a dark gypsy with a pheasant in his knapsack has gathered more by moonshine than wiser men have won. But I know a wizardry can take a buried acorn and whisper forests out of it to tower against the sun. There's many a magician from Baghdad to Benares can read you for a penny what your future is to be. And a flock of crazy prophets that by staring in a crystal can fill it with more fancies than there's herring in the sea. But I know a wizardry can break a freckled eggshell and shake a throstle out of it in every hawthorn tree. There's many a crafty alchemist from Mecca to Jerusalem, and Michael Scott and Merlin were reckoned very wise. But I know a wizardry can take a wisp of sunfire and round it to a planet and roll it through the skies with cities and seaports and little shining windows and hedgerows and gardens and loving human eyes. A great philosopher once said that where we see the results of thought or intellect produced by creatures without thought or intellect, we must suppose that behind the whole scheme of nature there is a greater mind using them as its instruments. In this case, the instrument is a bird, and the title of the poem is Bird Song. Tell me, you that sing in the blackthorn, out of what mind your melody springs. Is it the world soul throbs like a fountain up through the throat of an elf with wings? 5 sweet notes in a golden order, out of that deep realm quivering through, flashed like a phrase of light through darkness. But who so ordered them? Tell me who. You whose throats in the rain-drenched orchard peal your joys in a cadenced throng. You whose wild notes, fettered by beauty, move like the stars in a rounded song. Yours is the breath, but whose is the measure, shaped in an ecstasy past all art. Yours is the spending, whose is the treasure. Yours is the blood beat, whose is the heart. Minstrels all that have woven your housen of withes and twigs with a mind inwrought. Ye are the shuttles, but out of what darkness gathered these thoughtless patterns of thought? Bright eyes gleam through your elfin doorways, roofed with rushes and lined with moss. Whose are the voiceless pangs of creation? Yours is the wild bough, whose is the cross? Carols of light from a lovelier kingdom, gleams of a music on earth unheard, scattered like dew by the careless wayside, pour through the lifted throat of a bird. The next poem is called The Highwayman. It was a very early poem and written when I was staying in a cottage on the edge of Bagshot Heath, where the highwaymen used to resort in the 18th century. It was written on a very dark night when the wind was rushing through the pine trees. The wind was a torrent of darkness among the gusty trees. The moon was a ghostly galleon tossed upon cloudy seas. The road was a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor, and the highwayman came riding, riding, riding. The highwayman came riding up to the old inn door. He'd a French cocked hat in his forehead, a bunch of lace at his chin, a coat of the claret velvet, and breeches of brown doeskin. They fitted with never a wrinkle. His boots were up to the thigh, and he rode with a jewelled twinkle, his pistol butts a twinkle, his rapier hilt a twinkle, under the jewelled sky. Over the cobbles he clattered and clashed in the dark inn yard. He tapped with his whip on the shutters, but all was locked and barred. He whistled a tune to the window, and who should be waiting there but Bess, the landlord's daughter, the landlord's black-eyed daughter, plaiting a dark red love knot into her long black hair. And dark, in the dark old inn-yard, a stable wicket creaked, where Tim the ostler listened. His face was white and peaked, his eyes were hollows of madness, his hair like mouldy hay, but he loved the landlord's daughter, the landlord's red-lipped daughter. Dumb as a dog he listened, and he heard the robber say, "One kiss, my bonny sweetheart. I'm after a prize tonight, but I shall be back with the yellow gold before the morning light. Yet if they press me sharply and harry me through the day, then look for me by moonlight, watch for me by moonlight. I'll come to thee by moonlight, though hell should bar the way." He did not come in the dawning, he did not come at noon, and out of the tawny sunset, before the rise of the moon, when the road was a gypsy's ribbon looping the purple moor, King George's men came marching, marching, marching. King George's men came marching up to the old inn door. They said no word to the landlord, they drank his ale instead, but they gagged his daughter and bound her to the foot of her narrow bed. Two of them knelt at her casement with muskets at their side. There was death at every window and hell at one dark window, for Bess could see through her casement the road that he would ride. They had tied her up to attention with many a sniggering jest. They had bound a musket beside her with the muzzle beneath her breast. "Now, keep good watch." And they kissed her. She heard the doomed man say, "Look for me by moonlight, watch for me by moonlight. I'll come to thee by moonlight, though hell should bar the way." She twisted her hands behind her, but all the knots held good. She writhed her hands till the fingers were wet with sweat or blood. They stretched and strained in the darkness, and the hours crawled by like years, till now, on the stroke of midnight, cold on the stroke of midnight, the tip of one finger touched it. The trigger, at least, was hers. The tip of one finger touched it. She strove no more for the rest. Up she stood up to attention, with the muzzle beneath her breast. She would not risk their hearing. She would not strive again. For the road lay bare in the moonlight, blank and bare in the moonlight, and the blood of her veins in the moonlight throbbed to her love's refrain. Tlot, 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 had they heard it? The horse hoofs ringing clear. Tlot, 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 in the distance, Were they deaf that they did not hear? Down the ribbon of moonlight, over the brow of the hill, the highwaymen came riding, riding, riding. The redcoats looked to their priming. She stood up, straight and still. Tlot, tlot in the frosty silence, tlot, tlot in the echoing night. Nearer he came, and nearer. Her face was like a light. Her eyes grew wide for a moment. She drew one last deep breath. Then her finger moved in the moonlight. Her musket shattered the moonlight, shattered her breast in the moonlight, and warned him with her death. He turned, he spurred to the west. He did not know who stood bowed, with her head on the musket, drenched with her own blood. Not till the dawn he heard it, and his face grew grey to hear how Bess, the landlord's daughter, the landlord's black-eyed daughter, had watched for her love in the moonlight and died in the darkness there. Back he spurred like a madman, shouting a curse to the sky, with a white road smoking behind him and his rapier brandished high. Blood red were his spurs in the golden noon. Wine red was his velvet coat. And they shot him down on the highway, down like a dog on the highway. And he lay in his blood on the highway with a bunch of lace at his throat. And still of a winter's night, they say, when the wind is in the trees, when the moon is a ghostly galleon tossed upon cloudy seas, when the road is a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor, a highwayman comes riding, riding, riding. A highwayman comes riding up to the old inn door. Over the cobbles he clatters and clangs in the dark inn yard. He taps with his whip on the shutters, but all is locked and barred. He whistles a tune to the window, and who should be waiting there but Bess, the landlord's daughter, the landlord's black-eyed daughter, plaiting a dark red love knot into her long black hair. The next poem, Night Journey, was originally entitled St. Dunstan's Prayer. It was engraved on stone for the Isle of Wight Institute for the Blind, but it tries to suggest something more than merely the troubles of physical blindness, for we are all, symbolically at any rate, men on a night journey, seeing things as in a glass darkly. Thou who never canst err, for thyself art the way, thou whose infinite kingdom is flooded with day, thou whose eyes behold all, for thyself art the light. Look down on us gently, who journey by night. By the splendor revealed in thy loneliest hour, forsaken, self-bound, and self-emptied of power, thou who even in death hadst all heaven in sight. Look down on us gently, who journey by night. On the road to Emmaus they thought thou wast dead, but they saw thee anew in the breaking of bread. Though the day was far spent, in thy face there was light. Look down on us gently, who journey by night. I think I began to write poetry from pure happiness in the feeling for the music of words and the ideas that are expressed through that music. I've always hoped that the poems I write might express some of the happiness I felt in writing them. In poems like The Happy Hunting Grounds, 40 Singing Seamen, and even the wagon, which deals with age and death, I felt a happiness which transcended the immediate subject. One summer, when my children were over in Canada at school, we brought them down for their holidays to a cottage on the coast of Maine. We called it the Happy Hunting Grounds because one of the islands off the coast was called Pooduck Island, which was an Indian resort, and Pooduck in their language meant the place where the world ends. To us, it was also the place where the world began. I know a cottage on the coast of Maine. You walk through a wood by a winding lane till you come to a clearing where the waves say whoosh, and the sea swallow nests in a wild rose bush. And there you will find it as the honeybees know, with the rocks and the tide 12 yards below. And in among the rocks, with the dragonfly and bee, a foot-wide path takes the swimmer to the sea. And the little wild strawberries ridden underfoot, and the woodchuck nibbles at the rosemary root, and the green snake basks on the path as it goes down through the rocks with the wild red rose. Then a shining cloud-winged spirit of the sky, a lone three-masted ship goes by, and out and away in the deep sea blue, the dark pines cluster on an island or two. Salt, hard, flower-bright islands of the blest, where the blueberries grow and the herring gulls nest. And the fish-hawk over his pine tree wheels, and the cormorant cries to the barking seals, and you brush through the firs with their dew on your face, and the long grass misty with the Queen Anne's lace, till the red man's ghost in a birch canoe dips his paddle in the creeks he knew, and glides through the old sights and sounds by the shore of the shadowy hunting grounds. I know a cottage on the coast of Maine. Let a salt wave whisper and I'm living there again, by the tang of the rosin in a blue spruce bough, or the red of a maple. I'm living there now, looking through a window at my heart's delight, while the sea falls quiet and the west turns bright. Barefoot children in the sunset glow, running up the rocks from the little beach below, climbing through the crags from the shell-strewn shore, with a bucketful of clams to the open door. Through the scent of the briars, where the sea swallow stirs, and the squirrel chirrups in the sun-warmed firs. I know a cottage on the coast of Maine. Let a pine wood rustle and I'm living there again, writing or reading by a pine log far, or looking through a window at my heart's desire. Skies of vision and a sea at rest, and the face of my beloved as she turns to the west, on a rock above the water with a creel in her hand, and her bright eyes gazing at the sunset land. Skies of vision and a world of light, and a white sail homing at the fall of night. Sussex was the scene of the next poem, entitled The Wagon. It was suggested simply by the sight of a wagon of clover hay trundling over a white chalk road on the Sussex Downs, with a farm labourer lying apparently asleep on the top of the hay. Crimson and black on the sky, a wagon of clover slowly goes rumbling over the white chalk road. And I lie in the golden grass there, wondering why so little a thing as the jingle and ring of the harness, the hot creak of leather, the peace of the plodding, should suddenly, stabbingly make it strange that men die. Only perhaps in the same blue summer weather hundreds of years ago, in this field where I lie, Caedmon the Saxon was caught by the self-same thing. The surf lying dark with the sun on his beautiful wain-load, the jingle and ring of the harness, the hot creak of leather, the peace of the plodding, and wondered, oh, dreadfully wondered, that men must die. Caedmon, of course, was the early Saxon poet who might have felt very much the same kind of thing. My next poem, 40 Singing Seamen, describes how some British sailors most unexpectedly arrived in northern Africa. Across the seas of Wonderland to Mogador we plodded, 40 singing seamen in an old black bark, and we landed in the twilight where a Polyphemus nodded, with his battered moon eye winking red and yellow through the dark. For his eye was growing mellow, rich and ripe and red and yellow, as was time since old Ulysses bunged his eye up in the dark. Ulysses bunged his eye up with a pine torch in the dark. Were they mountains in the gloaming, or the giant's ugly shoulders, just beneath the rolling eyeball with its bleared and vinous glow, red and yellow or the purple of the pines among the boulders, and the shaggy horror brooding on the sullen slopes below? Were they pines among the boulders, or the hair upon his shoulders? We were only simple seamen, so of course we didn't know. We were simple singing seamen, so of course we could not know. But we crossed a plain of poppies, and we came upon a fountain, not of water, but of jewels, like a spray of leaping fire. And behind it, in an emerald glade, beneath a golden mountain, there stood a crystal palace for a sailor to admire. For a troop of ghosts came round us, which with leaves of bay they crowned us. Then with grog they well nigh drowned us to the depth of our desire. And 'twas very friendly of them, as a sailor can admire. There was music all about us. We were growing quite forgetful we were only simple seamen from the dirt of London town, though the nectar that we swallowed seemed to vanish half regretful, as if we wasn't good enough to take such victuals down, when we saw a sudden figure, tall and black as any, like the devil, only bigger, drawing near us with a frown. Like the devil, but much bigger, and he wore a golden crown. And what's all this, he growls at us. With dignity we chanted, 40 singing seamen, sirs, won't be put upon. What, Englishmen, he says? Well, if you don't mind being haunted, faith, you're welcome to my palace. I'm the famous Prester John. Will ye walk into my palace? I don't bear ye any malice. One and all ye shall be welcome in the halls of Prester John. So we walked into the palace and the halls of Prester John. Now the door was one great diamond, and the hall a hollow ruby, big as Beachy Head, my lads, nay, bigger by a half. And I sees the mate with mouth agape, a-staring like a booby, and the skipper close behind him with his tongue out like a calf. Now the way to take it rightly was to walk along politely, just as if you didn't notice. So I couldn't help but laugh, for they both forgot their manners, and the crew was bound to laugh. But he took us through his palace, and my lads, as I'm a sinner, we walked into an opal, like a sunset-coloured cloud. My dining room, he says. And quick as light we saw dinner spread before us by the fingers of a hidden fairy crowd. And the skipper, swaying gently after dinner, whispers faintly, I looks towards you, Prester John. You done us very proud. And we drank his health with honours, for he done us very proud. Then he walks us to his garden, where we sees a feathered demon, very splendid and important, on a sort of spicy tree. That's the phoenix, whispers Prester, which all educated seaman knows the only one existent, and he's waiting for to flee. When his 100 years expire, then he'll set himself afire, and another from his ashes rise, most beautiful to see, with wings of rose and emerald, most beautiful to see. Then he says, In yonder forest there's a little silver river, and whosoever drinks of it, his youth shall never die. The centuries go by, but Prester John endures forever, with his music in the mountains and his magic on the sky. While your hearts are growing colder, while your world is growing older, there's a music in the distance where the sea line meets the sky. It shall call to singing seamen till the fount of song be dry. So we thought we'd up and seek it, but that forest fair defied us. First, a crimson leopard laughs at us, most horrible to see. Then a sea-green lion came and sniffed and licked his chops and eyed us, while a red and yellow unicorn was dancing round a tree. We was trying to look thinner, which was hard, because our dinner must have made us very tempting to a cat a high degree, must have made us very tempting to the whole menagerie. So we scuttled from that forest, and across the poppy meadows where the awful shaggy horror brooded o'er us in the dark, and we pushes out from shore again, a-jumping at our shadows, and pulls away most joyful to the old black bark. And home again we plodded, while the Polyphemus nodded, with his battered moon eye winking red and yellow through the dark. Oh, the moon above the mountains, red and yellow through the dark. Across the seas of Wonderland, to London town we blundered, 40 singing seamen as was puzzled for to know if the visions we had seen were caused by. Here again we pondered, a tipple in a vision 40,000 years ago. Could the grog we dreamt we swallowed make us dream of all that followed? We were only simple seamen, so of course we didn't know. We were simple singing seamen, so of course we could not know. Prester John, of course, was a legendary figure for hundreds of years. Delamere once asked a friend of mine, why do poets write sonnets? I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I suppose the next poem, The Double Fortress, one of the few attempts that I've made at writing a sonnet in the Shakespearean form, was simply suggested by the idea of growing old. Time, wouldst thou hurt us? Never shall we grow old. Break as thou wilt these bodies of blind clay, thou canst not touch us here in our stronghold, where two made one, laugh all thy powers away. Though ramparts crumble and rusty gates grow thin, and our brave fortress dwines to a hollow shell, thou shalt hear heavenly laughter far within, where young as love two hidden lovers dwell. We shall go clambering up our twisted stairs to watch the moon through rifts in our grey towers. Thou shalt hear whispers, kisses, and sweet prayers creeping through all our creviced walls like flowers. Wouldst wreck us, time? When thy dull leaguer brings the last wall down, look heavenward. We have wings.
Your Blood this week. Tonight he reads Midnight Express by Alfred Noyes.
It was a battered old book bound in red buckram. He found it when he was 12 years old on an upper shelf in his father's library, and against all the rules, he took it to his bedroom to read by candlelight, when the rest of the rambling Elizabethan house was flooded with darkness. That was how young Mortimer always thought of it. His own room was a little isolated cell in which, with stolen candle ends, he could keep the surrounding darkness at bay, while everyone else had surrendered to sleep and allowed the outer night to come flooding in. By contrast with those unconscious ones, his elders, it made him feel intensely alive in every nerve and fiber of his young brain. the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall below, the beating of his own heart, the long-drawn rhythmical ah of the sea on the distant coast, all filled him with a sense of overwhelming mystery. And as he read, the soft thud of a blinded moth striking the wall above the candle would make him start and listen like a creature of the woods at the sound of a cracking twig. The battered old book had the strangest fascination for him, though he never quite grasped the thread of the story. It was called The Midnight Express, and there was one illustration on the 50th page at which he could never bear to look. It frightened him. Young Mortimer never understood the effect of that picture on him. He was an imaginative but not neurotic youngster, and he avoided that 50th page as he might have hurried past a dark corner on the stairs when he was 6 years old, or as the grown man on the lonely road in The Ancient Mariner, who, having once looked round, walks on and turns no more his head. There was nothing in the picture, apparently, to account for this haunting dread. Darkness, indeed, was almost its chief characteristic. It showed an empty railway platform, at night lit by a single dreary lamp, an empty railway platform that suggested a deserted and lonely junction in some remote part of the country. There was only one figure on the platform, the dark figure of a man, standing almost directly under the lamp, with his face turned away toward the black mouth of a tunnel, which, for some strange reason, plunged the imagination of the child into a pit of horror. The man seemed to be listening. His attitude was tense, expectant, as though he were awaiting some fearful tragedy. There was nothing in the text, so far as the child could read and could understand, to account for this waking nightmare. He could neither resist the fascination of the book, nor face that picture in the stillness and loneliness of the night. He pinned it down to the page facing it with 2 large pins, so that he should not come upon it by accident. Then he determined to read the whole story through. But always, before he came to page 50, he fell asleep, and the outlines of what he had read were blurred, and the next night he had to begin again and again before he came to the 50th page. He fell asleep. He grew up and forgot all about the book and the picture. But halfway through his life, at that strange and critical time when Dante entered the dark wood, leaving the direct path behind him, he found himself, a little before midnight, waiting for a train at a lonely junction. And as the station clock began to strike 12, he remembered like a man waking from a long dream. There, under the single dreary lamp, on the long glimmering platform, was the dark and solitary figure that he knew. Its face was turned away from him toward the black mouth of the tunnel. It seemed to be listening, tense, expectant, just as it had been 38 years ago. But he was not frightened now as he had been in childhood. He would go up to that solitary figure, confront it, and see the face that had so long been hidden, so long averted from him. He would walk up quietly and make some excuse for talking to it. He would ask it, for instance, if the train was going to be late. It should be easy for a grown man to do this. But his hands were clenched when he took the first step, as if he too were tense and expectant. Quietly, but with the old vague instincts awakening, he went toward the dark figure under the lamp, passed it, swung round abruptly to speak to it, and saw, without speaking, without being able to speak, it was himself staring back, as in some mocking mirror, his own eyes alive in his own white face, looking into his own eyes, alive. The nerves of his heart tingled as though their own electric currents would paralyze it. A wave of panic went through him. He turned, gasped, stumbled, broke into a blind run, out through the deserted and echoing ticket office, onto the long moonlit road behind the station. The whole countryside seemed to be utterly deserted. The moonbeams flooded it with the loneliness of their own deserted satellite. He paused for a moment and heard, like the echo of his own footsteps, the stumbling run of something that followed over the wooden floor within the ticket office. Then he abandoned himself shamelessly to his fear and ran, sweating like a terrified beast, down the long white road between the two endless lines of ghostly poplars, each answering another, into what seemed an infinite distance. On each side of the road there was a long, straight canal, in which one of the lines of poplars was again endlessly reflected. He heard the footsteps echoing behind him. They seemed to be slowly but steadily gaining upon him. A quarter of a mile away, he saw a small white cottage by the roadside, a white cottage with two dark windows and a door that somehow suggested a human face. He thought to himself that if he could reach it in time, he might find shelter and security, escape. The thin, implacable footsteps echoing his own were still some way off when he lurched, gasping, into the little porch, rattled the latch, thrust at the door, and found it locked against him. There was no bell or knocker. He pounded on the wood with his fists until his knuckles bled. The response was horribly slow. At last, he heard heavier footsteps within the cottage. Slowly they descended the creaking stair. Slowly the door was unlocked. A tall, shadowy figure stood before him, holding a lighted candle in such a way that he could see little either of the holder's face or form. But to his dumb horror, there seemed to be a cerecloth wrapped around the face. No words passed between them. The figure beckoned him in. As he obeyed, it locked the door behind him. Then, beckoning him again without a word, the figure went before him up the crooked stair, with the ghostly candle casting huge and grotesque shadows on the whitewashed walls and ceiling. They entered an upper room in which there was a bright fire burning, with an armchair on either side of it, and a small oak table on which there lay a battered old book bound in dark red buckram. It seemed as though the guest had been long expected, and all things were prepared. The figure pointed to one of the armchairs, placed the candlestick on the table by the book, for there was no other light but that of the fire, and withdrew without a word, locking the door behind him. Mortimer looked at the candlestick. It seemed familiar. The smell of the guttering wax brought back the little room in the old Elizabethan house. He picked up the book with trembling fingers. He recognized it at once, though he had long forgotten anything about the story. He remembered the ink stain on the title page, and then, with a shock of recollection, he came on the 50th page, which he had pinned down in childhood. The pins were still there. He touched them again, the very pins which his trembling childish fingers had used so long ago. He turned now to the beginning. He was determined to read it to the end now and discover what it was all about. He felt that it must all be set down there in print, and though in childhood he could not understand it, he would be able to fathom it now. It was called The Midnight Express, and as he read the first paragraph, it began to dawn upon him slowly, fearfully, inevitably. It was the story of a man who in childhood long ago had chanced upon a book in which there was a picture that frightened him. He had grown up and forgotten it, and one night upon a lonely railway platform he had found himself in the remembered scene of that picture. He had confronted the solitary figure under the lamp, recognized it, and fled in panic. He had taken shelter in a wayside cottage and had been led to an upper room, found the book awaiting him, and had begun to read it right through to the very end at last. And this book, too, was called The Midnight Express, and it was the story of a man who, in childhood, it would go on forever and forever and forever. There was no escape. But when the story came to the wayside cottage for the third time, a deeper suspicion began to dawn upon him. Slowly, fearfully, inevitably. Although there was no escape, He could at least try to grasp more clearly the details of the strange circle, the fearful wheel in which he was moving. There was nothing new about the details. They had been there all the time, but he had not grasped their significance. That was all. The strange and dreadful being that had led him up the crooked stair. Who and what was that? The story mentioned something else that had escaped him. The strange host who had given him shelter was about his own height. Could it be that he also... And was this why the face was hidden? At the very moment when he asked himself that question, he heard the click of the key in the locked door. The strange host was entering, moving toward him from behind, casting a grotesque shadow, larger than human, on the white walls in the guttering candlelight. It was there, seated on the other side of the fire facing him, with a horrible nonchalance, as a woman might prepare to remove a veil. It raised its hands to unwind the cerecloth from its face. He knew to whom it would belong, but would it be dead or living? There was no way but one. As Mortimer plunged forward and seized the tormentor by the throat, his own throat was gripped with the same brutal force. The echoes of their strangled cry were indistinguishable, and when the last confused sounds died out together, the stillness of the room was so deep that you might have heard the ticking of the old grandfather clock and the long-drawn rhythmical of the sea on a distant coast 38 years ago. But Mortimer had escaped at last. Perhaps, after all, he had caught the midnight express. It was a battered old book, bound in red buckram.
Joss Ackland has been reading Midnight Express by Alfred Noyes. It was abridged for radio by the producer Richard Dunn.